Okay, good evening, everyone, and thanks for letting me come and being part of your evening tonight. Looking forward to it. It was fun reminiscing some of the things that Kevin and Liz and I have done together, and it's always a treat to come up here. I have a cottage property in Gravenhurst. And I said to Doug, Dr. Doug, I'll come up. It's about a 4-hour drive from Gravenhurst. And I got this very curt email back from Doug saying, "You must have a very heavy foot." And I had made a mistake because last week I was in New Liskeard speaking, and that is 4 hours. But it's another 2 hours to get to here. So I didn't try to get here in 4 hours. Actually, I did because I came from North Bay yesterday. So I drove to North Bay, stayed there, and then drove up this morning and had lunch with Kevin and Liz and had dinner with Doug and Danielle and staying with them tonight. And then I'll see you guys tomorrow. So looking forward to this. And I don't know, how many times I've been here now? Do you remember? 4 or 5. Yeah, quite a number of years. More than that? Okay, all right. I just remember when Kevin got called here, I said to him, because, Kevin's one of my boys. I have to, okay, he's one of my boys, okay? You just got to say that. And I think he's okay with me saying that. I just said, hey, man, you're headed to the middle of nowhere. I almost was there myself. But Timmins, all right? And I said, hey, man, you know what? If you ever need help, need someone to come, speak, do a little bit of adult ed, I'm more than happy to come at any time. Just give me a shout, and it's on my dime. So he took advantage. He's taken advantage of that. So that's part of the reason why I'm here. So it's great fun, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys. I want to start with just a little devotional. I'd like you to turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 10. Deuteronomy chapter 10. And this is just a devotional, so not a lot. But we're all recipients of grace, right? We're all recipients of grace. We've received grace in having Christ given us salvation. We've all received grace in multiple ways. I mean, life's been difficult for many of us. I get it. And I've journeyed through some of that, continue to do so. But grace does pervade our lives. I think when we're honest about that, and the grace and the goodness of God somehow leaks its way through even some of the most difficult parts of our lives. And the book of Deuteronomy is a book that is the compilation of 3 final sermons by Moses. Okay? So we've got the books that were written by Moses, but his final one was the book of Deuteronomy, and it was to a new audience. The audience of the book of Deuteronomy were the kids of all the people that came out of Egypt. So we all know the story of the Exodus. We know about Pharaoh and Moses and the 10 plagues and the Red Sea and them coming to Mount Sinai and getting the 10 Commandments and other laws there. Then, of course, they left Mount Sinai and went into the wilderness and went to a place called Kadesh Barnea. And at Kadesh Barnea, they sent 12 spies into the land to spy out the land, to plan for how they were going to invade and conquer the land that God had given them. 10 of them came back and said, what? We can't do it, right? Too many giants in the land, it's too hard, never can do it. 2 of them came back and said, we can do it, let's go. Anybody know what their names are? Joshua and Caleb. All right? Unfortunately, however, the people listened to the 10 rather than to Joshua and Caleb. And so they rebelled and said to Moses, take us back to Egypt because at least we got food there. And they said, we miss the leeks and the onions. I'm not sure why you would miss leeks and onions, but they apparently missed those things. And God then said, okay, 40 years. 40 years in the wilderness. And anybody 20 years old and older is not going to enter the land. Anybody 20 years old or under 20 years, you will be the ones who will enter the land. So for 40 years, they lived in the wilderness, and they basically got really good at doing funerals. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. And they buried that whole generation of adults, 20 years old and older, those are the decision makers, and they buried basically the fathers and mothers and grandfathers and grandmothers. And so by the time we get to the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is really, really old, and two leaders have emerged to replace Moses. One was Joshua, and one was Caleb. And Moses is about to die. He's going to wander off into the wilderness and disappear. And before he does, he speaks to this new generation. These are the ones who have been doing the funerals over the last 40 years. So the oldest at Kadesh Barnea and basically Mount Sinai was 20. But most of the people that Moses is now talking to here in the book of Deuteronomy on a place called the Plains of Moab were born in the wilderness. They had not seen the plagues. They had not seen Mount Sinai. All they had ever known was wilderness and manna and quail and water out of rocks. All right? But at the same time, Moses was constantly reminding them that they were the recipients of grace. Even though they had not necessarily seen, some had, okay, but they were kids, or at least under 20 years old, but many of them had not. And so they had to be told and retold their history of how they got here. So now they are what you would call seated. They are located, they are camping on the Plains of Moab, which is on the east side of the Jordan River, and they could look across the Jordan River, and in the distance they could see the gleaming walls of Jericho. And they knew that in order to occupy the land, conquer the land, the first city that they would have to take would, of course, be Jericho. And most of us know the story of Jericho marching around the city and the walls falling down and all that kind of stuff. But what intrigues me about the book of Deuteronomy is that it's three sermons compiled into one book called the book of Deuteronomy to this new generation. And he is reminding them of grace. He is reminding them of all the stuff that God had done for their forefathers or foremothers, and in fact themselves. And in verse 12 of chapter 10, he says, "And now, O Israel," and you have to remember, Israel now is this new generation. Is it okay if I call them the Pepsi generation? Does that work? I use that in the college, and they don't get it. They don't know what the Pepsi generation is. Well, some of us know that was a moniker that we used a few years ago. And now, O Pepsi generation, Israel. And so, they've been in the wilderness for 40 years. The oldest person would now be 60, right? Because the oldest person at Kadesh Barnea, when they sent in the spies, is 20. So basically, the oldest person at this point is 60 years old. And there's quite a number of them, okay? According to the numbers in the Bible, there are actually millions of them. So this is a really big group of people Okay? And now, O new generation of Israel that have been burying your parents and grandparents for the last 40 years, but you have been the recipients of grace, what does the Lord God ask of you? And so this little text, a couple of verses long, basically I define as, how do we respond to grace? What are the means? What are the responses to grace? And there are 5 of them. And this is what he talks about, okay? 5 responses to grace. Number 1, now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God. That's number 1. Now, you got to understand that the word fear does not mean be afraid of. It's used throughout the Old Testament to basically, it's often used with another word, hava, which means to worship or to bow at the waist, to bend, to bow. And often fear, which is the word ra'ah, and hava, often they are used together, to fear and to worship. And so fear, while there is a little bit of the element of scaredness, if you like, which is not a word, but it's a notion of awe and respect. And I think that's the best way to describe it. But it's a word of worship. So our first response of grace, to grace, number 1, that we are a people of worship, that we fear, that we worship, we recognize, and the word worship in English is worthship, right? That's where it comes from. We announce and declare and recognize God's worth. So the first response is worship. Second, to walk in all his ways. Now, I love that word walk. The word walk is different than the word run, and it's different than the word crawl. It is simply journey. Journey with God. To journey in the ways of God. It has the idea of obedience. That is actually going to come down a little bit later. But it's much more of a notion of a lifestyle that wraps itself around the morals, the ethics, the spirituality of God. That we simply journey with what we know about what God loves and what God does not love. And that we walk alongside in that journey, recognizing, again, the morals, the ethics, the spirituality that God has decreed for us. So that's the second response to grace. And we journey with God because of grace. We say, thank you. I want to walk alongside of you and follow along in the way that you have instructed us to do so. Thirdly, to love him. Now, the Hebrew word love is the Hebrew word ahav. And if you can kind of hear ahav, you should be able to hear a proper name. Ahab, Ahab. Ahab. Anybody remember King Ahab? One of the kings in Israel? Well, he was King Love. And we all know that he was anything but King Love. He was actually the opposite. But probably the best way to define the word ahav, or to love, is to use the Greek word, which we all know probably is the word agape. And the whole notion of agape, or ahav, is to love in a way that is not expecting a response. It's a love of commitment. You know, husbands are told to love their wives. Wives are actually told to love their husbands. And it's a word that says, always act in the best interests of the other person. In fact, we're told to love our enemies, for that matter. Hopefully that's not our husband or our wife. But we're told to, and it's always acting in the best interests of the other person. And so the notion here in response to grace is to always act in the best interests of God. To make him your hero. To make him the picture of all that anybody would want to see in a God, in his grace, in his love, in his joy, in his bringing about peace, all those kinds of things. He's a God of justice, a God who cares for the poor, the orphan, and the widow. That's the word for justice, right? So to love him, always acting in the best interests of God, making sure that his name is famed. Maybe that's the best way to say it. That's the third response. Fourth, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So the next one, number 4, is to in fact engage in serving our God. Working on behalf, doing things that are part of his kingdom, doing things that will advance his cause in the world, doing things that would minister good God and the gospel to each other, to the community, whatever, to engage in service. That's a response of grace. So as you and I engage in service, whether leading our youth ministries, leading our children's ministries, leading our adult ministries, our women's and men's ministries, serving on the music team, on the worship team, serving back in the sound booth. Praise God for the people that work in the sound booth. That's all response to grace. It's because of grace, God's grace in our lives, that we say, yeah, I will do what I can to serve and minister to God's people and to Christ's church. And then the last one is obedience. Obedience. And to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you. To do what he says what we're supposed to do. To follow his moral and ethical teaching. To follow his commands. Commands to love one another. Commands to love God. And then all the instructions that we find in the New Testament about how we are to live our lives morally, ethically, spiritually, all those kinds of things. So that's the 5th response to grace. And then it ends with this really interesting phrase. And in the Hebrew text, it's actually a question. It says, is this not for your good? And I love that kind of final question. In response to grace, okay, we are called to worship, to journey, to agape, to serve with all our heart and all our soul, and basically means that everything, our whole complete being, and to obey. And in response to those 5 things, in response to those 5 responses to grace, he asks the question, is this not for your good? And the answer is what? Absolutely yes. And it's amazing. So you know what? I start with this to say, so often the Old Testament is viewed as a book of law. So often, in fact, in some theological ways of talking about the Old Testament, we talk about the Old Testament as the book of law and the New Testament as the book of grace. That is not true. Please abandon that idea, okay? Grace pervades the Old Testament just as much as it pervades the New. God's people on the plains of Moab were being challenged by grace, and we are regularly challenged by grace as well. And the 5 things that are articulated here come across with hardly any covenantal shift. They almost come straight across without any kind of movement from Old Covenant to New Covenant. They apply perfectly. And the question, are they not for our good, resonates to our time today. All right, so there we go. Got you started. This is kind of a warm-up to get you going. Now we start teaching, and the first thing that any good teacher does is give you a quiz. So find your piece of paper that you've been handed out. Okay, flip over the first page, and you'll see that it is blank. All right, no, go to the blank page. And I want you now to write down the answers to these questions. All right? And here is the quiz. This is your entrance exam. into the pearly gates. So this will determine whether Peter accepts you. No, just kidding. All right. Oh boy. Question number 1. Here we go. How many books in the Old Testament? How many books in the Old Testament? No, don't say. Shh, write it down. Anybody heard? It was 39. All right. How many books? And by the way, not part of this course, but how many books in the New Testament? Don't announce it. All right. Okay, we'll come back to it. All right. So how many books in the Old Testament? How many books in the New Testament? All right. Question number 1. Question number 2. Who or what is the oldest or earliest book in the Old Testament? What is the earliest or the oldest book in the Old Testament? No, quiet. Write it down. Just write it down. Just find a blank piece of paper and write it down, okay? That's all I'm doing here. I made up this quiz 5 minutes before this class, okay? So that's, I'm scrambling around. Okay, I got to begin with a quiz. Every good teacher has a quiz. Question number 3, all right? How many languages is the Old Testament written in? And English is not one of them, all right? Okay, how many languages was the Old Testament written in? We knew the New Testament was written in Greek. What was the Old Testament written in? And there were 2 languages. Anybody? Write those down. See if you, by the way, if Kevin fails this, you need to fire him as your pastor. All right, question number 4. Who wrote the most books in the Old Testament? Who wrote the most books? Not most of, but what author wrote the most books? All right, I know you're scrambling through, okay, Genesis, Exodus, and all that kind of stuff. All right. All right, question number 5. In the book of Psalms, how many Psalms did David write? Well, the point of a quiz is to help the students know that they don't know everything. So this is a way to kind of let us know that we all got something to learn here tonight. All right? So how many Psalms did David write? I won't ask you how many Psalms Asaph wrote. Or a few others. All right. And by the way, I asked that question because one of the courses that I teach at the seminary is the book of Psalms. And actually, I'm speaking on the Psalms tomorrow. So it is high on my mind all the time. Actually, the Psalms are critical of my own personal spirituality, but that's another story. All right. Okay, number 6. Name 5 minor prophets. Name 5 minor prophets. There are 12 of them, by the way. Okay, there are 12 minor prophets. Name 5. Okay, question number 7. Who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? How many can spell the book of Ecclesiastes? I write down E-C-C-L, period. There we go. All right. Who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? All right. Question number 8. Who wrote the prophecy of the virgin birth? Who wrote the prophecy of the virgin birth? The chapters are 7:14. What book did it come from? Okay, coming from one of my favorite books. Well, it's pretty tough to say it's a favorite book of the Bible because it's like saying you got a favorite child. But I have to confess, Leviticus is not the most not one of my go-to books. But name 3 judges. Name 3 judges. And if you can name the left-handed dude, you get bonus. All right? Okay. Okay, we're going to, what are we? Okay, we're already halfway into this. Okay. Who wrote the book of Proverbs? Who wrote the book of Proverbs? That's 10. All right, so here we go. How many books in the Old Testament? We already heard the number is 39. How many in the New Testament? 7, because 3 times 9 is 27, right? 39, 3 times 9 is 27. That's how you get Old Testament, New Testament. All right, so there's a little key for you. Who wrote what is the earliest book in the Bible? What is the first book? Enoch, the book of Enoch. No, Enoch is intertestamental. Sorry about that. Good. Job is not the oldest book in the Old Testament. Sorry. Job lived in the time of Abraham, about 2000 BC, but the book of Job was probably written in the time of Solomon. The first writer in the book, in the Old Testament, is Moses, who wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now you got to ask the question, of those 5 books, which one did he write first? Exodus. The oldest book in the Old Testament is Exodus. That's where Moses writes his own story. He writes the story of his bulrush birth or whatever. He writes his own story about Pharaoh's court. He writes his own story about killing an Egyptian overlord, going into the wilderness, coming to Mount Horeb. He writes his own story about going back into Pharaoh, let my people go. Writes about all the 10 plagues, the Red Sea, and getting to Mount Sinai. He writes all of that as his own biography, right? Now, he uses third person. Now, Moses did this, and Moses did that, and Moses did this. But it's basically, we believe that it is actually Moses wrote that book. Now, how the situation goes is some dude at the back of the crowd, when they're at Mount Sinai, okay, he's told all the stuff about getting there. They're now at Mount Sinai. They've come across the Red Sea. They've gone through a little bit of wilderness. They've come down to Mount Sinai. Some dude in the back of the crowd says, "Hey, Moshe, where did we come from? What's our story?" And Moshe says, "Good question. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was tohu vabohu, unformed and unfilled. And God said, let there be light." And then we get the creation account in Genesis 1. And we get the Garden of Eden account. And we get the Adam and Eve accounts. We get the Cain and Abel accounts. We get the Lamech accounts. We get the Enoch account. We get the Noah account. We get the Tower of Babel account. And then we get the accounts of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. There's the book of Genesis. And he tells them his story up to the time of when his own story began, because his story begins with Joseph, and the people go down into Egypt. And, of course, he is the one who, after 400 years, leads them out of Egypt. All right? And then, and we're going to talk about that, the rest of the books follow after that. The book of Leviticus, then the book of Numbers, and then, as I said, the book of Deuteronomy, which he speaks at the end to the new generation, because the old generation are all buried in the wilderness somewhere. Okay? All right, so We often think that Job is the first book written. It wasn't. It was probably written in the time of Solomon, and it's about a man who lived about the time of Abraham. I'm going to show you when that was, okay, in a few minutes. All right. Okay, how many languages are in the Old Testament? 2, and they are Hebrew and Aramaic. Very good. Anybody know where the Aramaic is in the Old Testament? Anybody know what book it's found in? Book of Daniel. Very good. All right, and a little bit in Ezra. All right, a little bit of Ezra, and then 6 chapters in the book of Daniel. All right, who wrote the most books in the Old Testament? I've already told you his name was Moses. All right, he wrote 5. All right, how many Psalms did David write? 72. Very good. You're off by 1. 73. Okay, very good. All right, he wrote 73. Very, very good. All right, and by the way, Asaph wrote 11. Okay, name 5 minor prophets. Good, okay, somebody can name them all. All right, so one of these or 5 of these, Hosea, say them together. If you know them, say them, all right? Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. All right, those are the 12 minor prophets, often called the Book of the 12. So if you got any 5 of those, welcome into the pearly gates. All right. Question number 7. Who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes? Okay, it's a dude by the name of Koheleth. All right. Smart guy. Okay. His name was Koheleth. We translate his name. Comes from the Hebrew word kahal, meaning to gather, and to gather in order to speak to or preach to. So that's why we call the author of that's why you see the words of the preacher or the words of the teacher. All right? So it comes from, so the word kahal or Koheleth means the teacher or the preacher. All right? But as we look at the descriptions of the preacher and the teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes, it is pretty clear, although some would disagree with me, including my own son, who is a teacher at Heritage, but he's got the right to be wrong. And he thinks he knows more than his father. Frankly, he does. Okay, but it seems to me, at least, that person that is described, whose name is Koheleth, is actually defined, because he's called the son of David, actually Solomon. So many of us think that it is Solomon that wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, right? And the book of Ecclesiastes is basically called Lectures to My Students. Yep.
So what who does Joel think wrote it?
He thinks that it's a post-exilic book written in the time of Ezra, who is taking on the persona of a Solomonic kind of person captured in the idea of wisdom, and that son of can mean descendant of. And there is legitimacy to those arguments, but he's still wrong. All right? My son and I, he's got a PhD in Old Testament like I do. He followed his father's footsteps, which I'm very, very proud of, obviously. He teaches at the school. I didn't hire him, by the way. No nepotism. I did not hire him. So we have fun because we disagree on a few things, on technical things like the date of the book of Joel. All right? Now, we named him Joel. He wrote his PhD dissertation on the book. He wrote 300 pages on 3 chapters and still got it wrong. And I put the book of Joel as just prior to the great exile by Babylon, and he puts it after the exile in the post-exilic era. And Doug, please don't ask me for the argument on that one. I'd have to actually explain that in significant detail. All right. Who wrote the prophecy on the virgin birth? Something 7:14. Anybody know? Isaiah. Okay, Isaiah 7:14 is, behold, a virgin will conceive and bear a child and call his name Emmanuel. All right, name 3 judges. Okay, anybody? Shout them out. Nope. Deborah, Samson, Gideon, Ehud. Anybody know Ehud? He's a left-handed dude with a dagger, right? My favorite story in the book of Judges is the Ehud and Eglon story, right? That's the dude with the dagger who takes on the big fat king called Eglon, which means circle. Also means, seriously, that's the word mean. The word means circle and it means bull, like calf, right? And the whole story is Eglon is the fatted calf. And Ehud's got a dagger in his left hand, which is the problem for good old Ehud, or for Eglon, right? And I'll never forget telling that story of Ehud and Eglon to a Christian school in the church that I was pastoring at the time, Central Baptist. And it went from kindergarten to grade 6, or grade 8. Anyhow, I forgot that I had kindergarten kids in there. And I told the story of Ehud and Eglon, complete with a dagger under my coat, which I pulled out at the most strategic point in the story and traumatized a whole class of kindergarten kids, one of whose name was Marla, who became the church secretary, who reminded me on her first day of work that she has still undergone the trauma of a kindergarten kid in that class telling the story of Ehud and Eglon. All right. Yeah, so Ehud, Samson, Deborah, Barak, Gideon, Jephthah. Anybody get Jephthah? Okay, the guy that sacrificed his daughter. You got that one? All right, sure. Good stuff. All right. Who wrote the book of Proverbs? Solomon wrote most of it, but he didn't write all of it. Okay, there's a section in there that says it was written by the wise ones, and then at the end, it's got a guy by the name of Lemuel and another guy by the name of Agur, A-G-U-R. We don't know who those guys are, but they wrote the last 2 chapters of the book, all right? So he wrote most of it, but he didn't write all of it, even though it starts off by saying the Proverbs of Solomon. So it was added to after Solomon finished writing his stuff. Okay, all right, that was only supposed to take 15 minutes. Now I want you to come to your note, find your notes, okay, find your notes, and start on that first page where it says Old Testament survey, timeline, canon, and background charts. The Old Testament, it's massive and complex. However, 2 Timothy 3:16 says that all Scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for instruction in righteousness, and that the child of God may be thoroughly furnished unto every good work. All right, and you have to understand, when Paul wrote that to Timothy, the New Testament had not yet been written. So what was he talking about? All Scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for. He was talking about the Old Testament. Now, it applies to the New Testament, absolutely. But when Paul wrote that, he was talking about the Old Testament, and we need to understand that the Old Testament is a book that is for the church. The Old Testament was the Bible of the church in the first century. The Old Testament was the Bible of Jesus. The Old Testament was the Bible of Paul. All right? And when he said, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, he meant the Psalms in the Old Testament. Okay? So there's no way we need to be saying the Old Testament is irrelevant, it's Old Covenant, we shouldn't be dealing with it, just deal with the New Testament. Well, now you're saying we ought not to deal with the Bible that Jesus read. We ought not to deal with the Bible that the first century church read. And we ought not to deal with the Bible that Paul says was God-breathed and profitable so that we all may be instructed in righteousness. So I have spent my career, okay, working in Old Testament, and I hope I am a solid New Testament Christian, having spent my times in the Old. All right. All right, 39 different books. We've already talked about that. 25 or more authors. We've talked about a few of those. I'm going to give you a timeline in just a minute, written in 2 languages. It was written over 1,500 years and through the empires of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. So world empires passed through the Old Testament. It has both story, prose, and poetry, okay? About half and half. About half of it is story, and the other half is poetry, like Psalms, and a lot of the prophets were written in poetry. And all different kinds of writings. We have law, we have psalm, we have wisdom, we have prophecy, we have apocalyptic, okay? So a number of different genres, and we find, I like to talk about the fact as the Old Testament as a library of 39 books. And we have different kinds of books in that library. So the book of Leviticus is a very different book than, say, the book of Psalms. And the book of Leviticus is a very different book than the book of Proverbs. And the book of Isaiah is a very different book than the book of Job. So we have these different kinds of writings. And I spend a lot of time teaching what we call a fancy word called hermeneutics, and how to read and understand the different types of writings that we find in the Old Testament and the New. I mean, the New Testament's not all the same either, right? We've got gospel, we've got epistle, we've got apocalyptic, like the book of Revelation, right? So you got a couple of different genres going on even in the New Testament. So a number of different types of writings. Now, what I want to, I'm going to just do this real quickly, and then we'll take our break. I want you to draw a line like that. And I'm going to give you, this is where it says here, basic time chart of the Old Testament. Okay, let's chart it. Okay, the line is already on your page. I forgot about that. All right, so here is 0, and here is 2000. All right? Basically, the dates that we know for sure with some level of certainty within 100 years go from 2000 to 0. Okay? Prior to that, we're not quite sure what the dates are, and there's all kinds of discussion about when creation happened and when Noah happened and all that kind of thing. But what the dates that we know with relative certainty start in 2000 BC. So in other words, about the same distance from where we are from Christ, the other side. Okay? And this person here is Abraham. So we date Abraham about 2000 BC. Of course, we date Christ at 0. So once we've got the story of, once we get to Abraham, we can pretty well chart out the chronology of the rest of the Old Testament. All right? And by the way, that's where we would put Job, as when he lived. The book was written in the time of Solomon. In the same way, the story of Abraham was not written by Abraham. The story of Abraham was written by Moses. So here we go. So we start at 2000, we go to 0, we divide that in half. 1000 BC. What major player lived in 1000 BC? Halfway between Abraham and Jesus. Anybody want to take a guess? No? I heard Moses. The answer is not quite. Did I hear David? Very good. All right, David. So David is 1000 BC. All right? So isn't this easy? We've got Christ at 0, or let's start with Abraham at 2000. We divide that in half, we get David. All right? Now, let's divide that in half into a quarter, and 1500 BC. What major player lived in 1500 BC? Anybody want to take a run at it? I heard Moses. And we could put on that the Exodus. All right? Now, All right? You're kind of getting the drift here, right? So we're going from 0 to or go from 2000 to 0. Halfway, we get to David. We're going to divide that in half, get 1500, we get Moses. Now you're going to say, well, I know what he's going to do next. Exactly right. Well, who lived in approximately 500 BC? What major player? Daniel. Very good. Daniel. And we'll put another E and put exile. All right? So what we do here now is now you have got a basic timeline of what the Old Testament looks like. Start at 2000, divide that in half and get David, divide that into quarters and get Moses, divide that into a quarter and get Daniel. Now, here we go. Where would Solomon fit into this chart? Before or after David? Before or after Daniel? Before. Okay, so now we can plot. There's Solomon. See now how this is beginning to work? All right. Where would Ezra fit into this chart? Before or after David? Okay, after. Before or after Daniel? After, right? He's after the exile, right? Him and his buddy Nehemiah are side by side. And so we would put Ezra about here. All right? Where am I going to put Joshua? Before or after David? Before. Before or after Moses? After, but sort of. Okay. So we got Joshua about here. All right? Where am I going to put Joseph? Before or after David? Joseph. Joseph. Okay? Before David, before or after Moses? Before or after Abraham? After. Okay, so we're going to put Joshua, no, who does it? Joseph, sorry. It's a long drive today. All right, Joseph. And so I guess what I find really helpful here, now you may not be able to put everybody that you can think of, but basically what we're saying here is between Abraham and Moses, we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, right? Then Moses comes along, all right? And after Moses, you've got Joshua and the judges, right? So Joshua and the judges. Then you've got David and Samuel lived at basically the same time as David. And then between David and Daniel, you got Solomon and all the kings leading up to the exile, right? Then you got the exile, people in exile such as Daniel was in exile, Ezekiel was in exile. So you got those coming. And then after the exile, you've got Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And you got 3 minor prophets. I'll get to that in another chart. Haggai, Zechariah, and good old Malachi. All right, the only Italian in the Bible. All right, so there is a basic timeline of the Old Testament. Now, I know this is probably brand new to many of you, but others of you will kind of resonate with what's going on here. And you can see that it actually works out pretty simple. Start at 2000, okay, then we get to Christ. And start with Abraham. Divide that in half and get David. Divide that in half and you get Moses and the Exodus. And divide that in half and you get Daniel and you get another E called the exile. All right, I think you've absorbed enough. It's time for a break.
So we'll break about 10 to 15 minutes. Grab some snacks. You're over there.
Everybody besides Liz say the books of the Old Testament. Anybody? We take a run at it? Anybody willing to stand up and take a run at it? Everybody's shaking their heads.
Is this chart pretty accurate?
Yeah, you could, yeah, not in the right order, but, okay, well, you'll know some of them, so let's walk through them, all right? Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. It always gets lighter when we hit the minor prophets. Okay, very good. Some of you are able to rattle it off. That's great. Good. All right, so you have a chart with a bunch of boxes. All right, and now I'm going to walk you through the flow of the Old Testament. All right, and we're going to start with the book of Genesis. Even though it was not the first book written, it actually is the first book that tells the story of God's work, and beginning with creation and then moving through the story of the Old Testament into the time after the exile, what we call the post-exilic period. So, the way we're going to work this is this line here is what we would call kind of the historical flow. The books that we're going to put there move the story along. You know, decade by decade, century by century, bit by bit, starting with creation and ending with the people back in the land after the exile. Okay? We all know that there was this big exile, and it lasted 70 years, and then they came back. And that's the end of the Bible. All right? At about 400 BC, we find the story of the Old Testament closes, and we have what we call the 400 silent years before we get Jesus and the New Testament appearing on the scene. So we start with the book of Genesis, okay? And we begin with the story of creation, with the creation narrative in Genesis 1. And as I said before, so we get creation, we get Adam and Eve, okay? We get Cain and Abel. We get, let me think, Lamech, and then Enoch, then Noah, and let's quickly go to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. All right, so that brings us to the end of the book of Genesis. At the end of the book of Genesis, the story is carried on by the book of Exodus. In the story of Exodus, we start in Egypt, okay, with Joseph's family, or Jacob's family down there. Joseph is down there. They're in Egypt. Joseph has risen to prominence. He's brought his family down, and they are there for 400 years, living in what we call the Delta area, land of Goshen. And for the last couple of hundred years that they were there, it was a horrific experience as they were enslaved by the Egyptians. And that story is told to us in Exodus chapter 1. But then we start in Exodus chapter 2, and a person appears on the scene, and of course, his name is Moses. And so the story of Exodus starts with them in Egypt. It's the story of Moses, and it takes us to Mount Sinai. So it takes us to Mount Sinai. It talks about Moses being born in the basket of bulrushes, raised in Pharaoh's court, and then, of course, eventually leading the people, coming back in, and the various events that happened in Moses' life. And then eventually he confronts Pharaoh. The 10 plagues happen. They cross the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is destroyed. They carry on for a little while. They need food, so they get manna and quail, water out of a rock. And finally, in Exodus 20, Exodus 19, Exodus 20, they arrive at Mount Sinai, and the story stops. All right? And what we find in the rest of the book of Exodus is what happened at Mount Sinai. Getting the 10 Commandments, the golden calf event, the various laws concerning the tabernacle, that kind of thing. So basically, the book of Exodus takes us from their time in Egypt to Mount Sinai. The next book of the Bible that moves the story from Mount Sinai is the book of Numbers. So the next book that you want to put along here is Numbers. And you say, wait a minute, what happened to Leviticus? Well, Leviticus is the appendix to the book of Exodus. Leviticus simply picks up the laws that God was giving at Mount Sinai, 10 Commandments, laws of the tabernacle, and then there is this book that we call the book of Leviticus that is a whole bunch more laws that God gave at Mount Sinai. So it's the appendix to the book of Exodus. It doesn't move the story. It's stuff that is given while they're there. So they get all kinds of laws about sacrifices, about the tabernacle, about the various other feasts that they're supposed to observe, and that kind of thing. So it's a book of laws. All right? If you want a book to read when you're having a tough time to sleep, that's the book to go to. All right? It is a mind-numbing, God-breathed book. Profitable for instruction. And sometimes we wonder why or how. That's a whole other discussion for another day. I can't start into that. Otherwise, I'm going to use all my time talking about how we should read the book of Leviticus. All right. So the story now carries on, and the book of Numbers brings us from Mount Sinai to the plains of Moab and the new generation that I just talked to you about. So they go from Mount Sinai, they leave Mount Sinai, go to Kadesh Barnea, they send in the 12 spies, 10 of them come back and say, we can't do it, 2 of them say we can, they follow the 10, God says, boom, for 40 years in the wilderness. That's the book of Numbers. Okay? In Hebrew, see, the book of Numbers is a bad way to define the book. It's not about numbers, although there are numbers in it. Okay? The Hebrew title of the book of Numbers is Bamidbar, in the wilderness. Okay? And that's a far better title than the book of Numbers. I don't know why our English Bibles chose Numbers when the Hebrew title is in the wilderness. And that's exactly what the book is all about. Okay? So it's basically tracing about 40 years in the wilderness, going from place to place, dealing with battle after battle, getting a few more laws along the way. All right? And the best commentary that you can read on the book of Numbers, published by Baker. Okay? I think it's published. No, maybe Zondervan. Anyhow, I forget who published it. But the author is Joel David Barker. So the best commentary in the book of Numbers is written by my son. All right? And by the way, it's a very good commentary. I really encourage you, if you want to read a little bit on the book of Numbers, go ahead. getting by his book. Besides, he needs the sales because he's poor. All right. All right, so the next book that moves us along is the book of Joshua, because Joshua takes them from the plains of Moab and crosses the Jordan River and moves them into the land. And you say, well, wait a minute, what about the book of Deuteronomy? Aha. The book of Deuteronomy is the appendix to the book of Numbers. It doesn't move the story. They're on the plains of Moab. And by the way, just real quick, if I was to draw a map of Israel, okay, here's the Sea of Galilee, here's the Dead Sea, here's Egypt down here, Mount Sinai is down here somewhere. They cross, they go down to Mount Sinai, okay? They come up to Kadesh Barnea here, send in the spies. They choose not to go. They wind up in the wilderness for another 40 years. Okay? Then finally, they come up this side of the Dead Sea, and here they are at the plains of Moab, and Jericho is right here. So they're looking across the Jordan River at Jericho, realizing that that is the first city that they're going to have to conquer. So at this point, Moses speaks to the Pepsi generation. And that's the book of Deuteronomy. And he is talking to them about history. He's talking to them about grace. And he's talking to them about response. There are a few more laws given for this new generation as they are to enter the land. There's a couple of extra laws on tithing and a few other things that they added at that particular point. But what this does is at the end of Deuteronomy, it brings to completion 613 laws that Israel has recorded in the Pentateuch, or Genesis to Deuteronomy. So they were committed in, I would argue that they had way more laws than this, but the ones that we have recorded in the scriptures, there are 613 of them. 10 of them are the 10 Commandments, and 603 are other kinds of laws. Laws of tithing, laws of Sabbath keeping, sacrifice laws, laws of pilgrimage, such as journeying to the sanctuary 3 times a year, laws concerning women, laws concerning men, laws concerning clothing. There's a law in Deuteronomy 22 that says you're not to plow with an ox and a donkey, all right? There's another law that says before you cut down a tree, you have to make sure there's no bird's nest in it. Okay, that's another law. Another law that says if you build a house, you have to build a balcony all the way around the edge of your house on the roof. And that was because all the roofs in that day were flat, right? And they lived on the top. So actually a law saying that you had to build a parapet or a balcony or a railing all the way around the edge of your house so that people wouldn't fall off, right? There was a law that says that men in particular had to have 4 tassels on the edges of their coats to remind them of the Torah, and all kinds of other laws that we find. 613 of them. You say, oh, man, 613. Have you ever read the Canadian law? Have you ever read, income tax law? Highway Traffic Act would have more than 613 laws, right? So, yeah, we only have some, the ones that have been inscribed in Scripture. But anyhow, so at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, at the end of this book, the appendix to the book of Numbers, we have the completion of the giving of the law, and Moses is speaking to the Pepsi generation. He is helping them to understand grace. He is trying to prepare them to enter the land, and at this particular point, he then wanders off into the wilderness and disappears. They send people to look for him, can't find him, and in the meanwhile, he's laid his hand on who who will lead the people into the land. That guy's name is Joshua. So Joshua is Moses' successor, mentoree, and that leads us then to the book of Joshua. And the book of Joshua is basically conquest. All right? It's a story after story after story of conquest. Okay? Places like Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. 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 Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. And the walls come a-tumbling down. Very good. All right? So you got Joshua and Jericho. You got Joshua, who, of course, had a failure at Ai. Right? Then he conquers cities like Lachish and Megiddo and Hatzor. Right? And then in Joshua 24, kind of the climax of the book, they go to a place called Shechem. And in Shechem, there are two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And he, at that particular point, gathers all the people, puts half of them on Mount Ebal, half of them on Mount Gerizim, and they recount the covenant. And it's a covenant renewal ceremony that Joshua leads them in. And that's where we find that very famous verse, but as for me and my house, what's the rest of it? We will serve the Lord, right? And basically what he does at that point at Shechem is say to them, listen, this is all the things that God has done for you. This is the covenant that he made for you. This is all his grace that he showed you. Now, choose today whom you will serve. Are you going to serve the gods of the Amorites and the Canaanites? Or are you going to serve Yahweh, the true God of Israel that has done all this for you? And they say, yeah, we will serve Yahweh. And he says, then put away the idols that are in your tents. I know they're there. And he challenges them. And this is just before he passes off the scene, right? But then he says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So basically the point of the book of Joshua is not settlement, but immobilization. Immobilizing the powers of these city-states and getting them ready to be settled and to take over the land. Okay? So his job was not to settle everybody in there, although he did allocate the tribes, but it was basically to immobilize the Canaanite peoples and get their feet on the ground, as it were. The settlement was to come in the time of the judges. And so here we find these judges coming along, and the people were not following through on their commitment at Shechem and Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And what they were doing was that they were chasing the idols of the resident Canaanites. And so time after time, while these people were trying to settle the land, while they were trying to occupy all these cities and drive out the Canaanites, they were also beginning to integrate with them. And this was a time of great apostasy. The time of Joshua was a time of great victory. A couple of setbacks. Maybe some of you know the story of the Gibeonites. But a couple of setbacks. Ai was a classic. But now Judges is a time of decline. And their call to settle the land was failing. And so God would send them oppressors. Time after time after time after time. Okay, and so he sent the Moabites, he sent the Gibeonites, he sent all kinds of other ites. And every time it says, and the stories all follow the same cycle. They disobeyed the Lord, God sends a people to punish them, they cry out to the Lord, God raises up a deliverer, delivers them. The people respond well. The land had rest, and then back into the cycle again, time after time after time. And it walks through, starts with Ehud. There's one prior to that, but he's just kind of a paradigm. Okay, starts with Ehud, then it goes to Baruch, okay, who's a wimp. And basically he says to Deborah, unless you go with me, I won't go. And he says, and God empowers Deborah to lead the people to victory, along with another woman by the name of Yael, okay, who puts a tent peg through Sisera's head. All right, cool story. But if you really want stories to read to grade 6 boys, this really works well. Just don't read Ehud and Eglon to a bunch of kindergarten kids. All right. Okay. And then that is followed by by Gideon, who, by the way, he's struggling with his faith, okay, and throws out the fleece and all the rest of that jazz. By the way, putting out a fleece is an act of non-faith. It's not an act of faith. It's an act of non-faith. God had told him what to do. And he's, well, I'm not sure. Let me put a fleece out. And, of course, he does it twice, right? And reverses it every time. That is not a way to determine the will of God. That is showing that he was a man lacking faith. Because God had told him explicitly, do what I tell you, and I'll go with you. And, of course, you know the story with the torches and the pots and all the rest of that jazz. So that's Gideon, and then you get his son, God by the name of Abimelech, who is an absolute apostate, okay, and creates all kinds of issues. But again, the same cycle, all right? They disobey the Lord. God brings in an oppressor. They cry out to God. He raises up a savior. The people respond, and the land has rest for 40 years, whatever. And then around it goes again. The next judge, so we started with Ehud, go to Deborah and Yael and Baruch. Then you go to Gideon. The next judge is a guy by the name of Jephthah. And Jephthah is famous for what? Sacrificing his daughter, right? So Jephthah is Jephthah is the son of a man who had him by means of a prostitute. And the other brothers, born to the legitimate wife, kicked Jephthah out because they didn't want him in the inheritance. So he gets kicked out, but they're attacked. And meanwhile, Jephthah has collected a bunch of guerrilla fighters around himself. So they call him back in, and he makes a deal with the brothers, but he also tries to make a deal with the invader. He sends letters, treaty letters. It's rejected. So Jephthah says to God, okay, I'm going to go do battle with these people, and he makes a vow. And the vow was what? Anybody remember? The vow was, first thing that comes out of my house, I will sacrifice to the Lord. Right? And you have to understand that they lived in kind of agricultural compounds. So the first thing that that they would meet coming to their house would be some kind of animal. All right? But wouldn't you know it, who comes out of the house first? His daughter. And he says, oh, woe is me, I have vowed a vow. Now the trouble with this is twofold. One, there is a law in Leviticus 27 that he knows about. Remember, Leviticus, Moses. We're long after Moses. And Leviticus 27 says that if you have made a foolish vow, you can pay your way out. Here are the number of shekels. And it actually says the number of shekels. And he doesn't follow it. So the second thing he does, he commits human sacrifice. And he murders his daughter as a sacrifice to God. Do you think God was pleased with that sacrifice? Nope. And that's the story of Jephthah. He has victory. He wins. But it ends with this tragic story. He says to his daughter, woe is me. She says to him, let me go into the hills and bewail my virginity, whatever that means. She goes there and this is not an 8-year-old, okay? And she goes with her friends, comes back, and the text says, and he did unto her as he had vowed. And the vow was, Olah, burnt offering. Brutal. But you know the neat part of that story? Guess what chapter he is named in the New Testament? Anybody? By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. Hebrews 11. The faith chapter, and Jephthah is named there as a man of faith. You know what that says to me? I got a chance. If he can make it, so can I. And by the way, so can you. And it's fascinating that so many of the people that are listed in Hebrews 11, we call it the faith chapter, are flawed people. They are not perfect people. They are flawed. They are broken. Moses is one of them. Abraham is one of them. Jephthah is one of them. Gideon is one of them. And what that does for me is to say, thank you. It's called mercy. It's called grace. Right? Anyhow, so that's the story of Jephthah. And then the people rebel again. And then we get the last judge, which of course is that famous judge that we know as Samson. Right? And good old Samson, most of us know that story. He's a Nazirite. He wasn't supposed to touch dead animals, and he did. He wasn't supposed to drink wine, he did. Wasn't supposed to get his hair cut, and he did. Good old Delilah looked after that one for him. Right? And he dies by suicide by knocking down a Philistine temple to Dagon, but at the same time, frees the Israelites from the Philistines. So while he is a tragic hero, right, the story ends well. And God is the hero of the story. Okay, so there you go. And then there's 2 appendices to the book of Judges, which are absolutely brutal. Okay? I won't bother going through with those. Those are very, very difficult. They both are, especially the second one. And I would, you know what, guys? While I talk about the beauty of the Old Testament, I talk about the grace of the Old Testament, there are some brutal stories in there, and I get it, I understand it, and sometimes the stuff is horrible. And I'll tell you, some of these chapters, especially the second appendix in the book of Judges, for some will be really triggering. And I think maybe, let's put it this way, I don't think the whole Old Testament should be read to children. Right? It's not a child's book. It's an adult book. In many ways, R-rated for sex and violence. Okay? Let's be honest about what we've got here. All right? Let's not play games. We're all adults in this room. We get it. Okay? So I know my daughter would not read the Noah story to her children when they were young. Okay? And yet we put Noah's Ark and rainbows in our children's nurseries. Has anybody read the story? It's called genocide. Right? Under God. And some of these stories are difficult. And I'll tell you, that second appendix at the end of Judges is really, really, really tough. Okay? So, okay, we're moving along here. Okay, I'm supposed to be done by now. Okay, Judges. Now, the next story that moves us along is the book of Samuel. I'm going to go 1st and 2nd Samuel. And you say, well, wait a minute, what happened to Ruth? Well, Ruth is another appendix to the book of Judges. All right? And Ruth starts off by saying, in the days that the judges ruled. And you've got this story. Basically, the book of Ruth is the story of Naomi. And she starts, being exiled to Moab. Her husband dies. Her 2 sons marry a couple of Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. They die. Naomi wants to go back to Bethlehem, which is her hometown. Orpha goes back, which is fine. No issue there. Nothing against Orpha for doing that. But Ruth says, my God will be your God will be my God, your people, my people, comes back. And we know the story of Ruth and how she gleans and meets Boaz and the whole story of Ruth and Boaz. And the whole story ends with Naomi saying, I started empty and now I am full. And her story comes kind of to a happy ending at the end of Book of Ruth. But it's basically a side story to the Judges that are happening throughout the Book of Judges. Okay, so that's why we kind of drop it off. It doesn't move the story along. It's kind of a side story to the events of the Judges. Okay, Samuel comes along, and basically, I'll just simply say it, the books of 1st and Samuel, 1st, 2nd Samuel, is the story of David. If you want to read the story of David, start in 1 Samuel 1, read to 2 Samuel to whatever the end chapter is, I forget, okay? And you'll start with Samuel being born, Hannah, Samuel, and then, of course, King Saul. He gets sideways with God. King David then gets anointed by Samuel. You get this David and Goliath story and all the other famous stories that we know about David, including Bathsheba and a whole bunch of other stuff for David, okay? So the books of Samuel are basically, some people call them actually the books of David, all right? Now, you'll notice I've got a line dropped off, that one, down to a box down here. And the reason why I asked you who wrote most of the Psalms or how many Psalms did David write is that David is what we would call the kind of the primary writer, figure, person in the book of Psalms. All right? So I believe he begins the book. I think the first Psalms are written by him. Okay? It was added to over time. But we also know that we have a psalm by Moses. Psalm 90 is by Moses. So we know that there was a psalm written in Moses' day that didn't get into the book of Psalms until Psalm 90. All right? So that's quite a ways down through the book before it finally winds up in the book. All right? So we've got Psalms written as early as Moses, and we've got Psalms written as late as Ezra. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. And it's recounting the fact that they had been in Babylon. So we've got Psalms written in the post-exilic era. So while David wrote 73 of them, he didn't write all of them. And the book grew over time. Okay? It's sort of book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5. And if you look at your book of Psalms, it is divided into 5 books. Singspiration 1, Singspiration 2, some of you know what I'm talking about there. Others of you have no idea what I just said. Okay? But you get these little chorus books and you keep adding to them over time, right? That's exactly what happened to the book of Psalms. And the last book, book 5, was added to the entire book of Psalms in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the post-exilic period. All right. So we've come now to David. We've come now to Samuel, 1st, 2nd Samuel. Then we get 1st and 2nd Kings. And basically, this is the story of Solomon to the exile. So this traces Israel's history from approximately 1,000. Solomon's about 950 after David, okay? From approximately 1,000 to about 500. It's about 500 years of history in 1st and 2nd Kings. All right? And during this time, all right, we have Saul, we have David, we have Solomon, and then the kingdom is divided into 2, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is completely apostate. Their capital is at Samaria, and they build a temple on Mount Gerizim. The southern kingdom, okay, we often call the northern kingdom the 10 tribes. The southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, stay focused on Jerusalem, and their kings go back and forth. between good and bad. So you got kings like Hezekiah, you got kings like Josiah and Joash, kings like that. And then you got other kings like Ahaz and, I just lost a big one in my name. So anyhow, a bunch of kings that some were good, some were bad, right? But up north, you got kings like Ahab. Oh, king in the south was Jehoshaphat. King in the north was Ahab. That kind of thing. So the northern kingdom was completely apostate, and they went into captivity by the Assyrians in 722 BC. The southern kingdom goes into captivity by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And so this is the exile. So Solomon, then it divides into two. They two go parallel. Northern kingdom captivity, 722 by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom carries on for another 150 years, but they finally apostatize. God says, enough, boom, you're going into exile by the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. For 70 years, they are in captivity. All right, in Babylon. But then a guy by the name of Cyrus comes along, who is a Persian king who conquered Babylon. And the first thing that he does is pronounce an edict that says to all the nations that have been taken captive by the Babylonians, including the Jewish nation, and says, please go home. And he sends everybody home. Now, the only one we have recorded for us is Cyrus sending the Jewish people home. But we know that that was his foreign policy. It wasn't just the Jewish people that he sent home. And basically he said, please all go home and please pray for me in your temples to your gods. All right? He was very polytheistic. He was trying to get everybody to pray for him, just in case one of them took, right? So we find the story in the book of Ezra about how they came back. And then we find the story in Nehemiah of how they got settled and they built the temple and they rebuilt the walls and got the whole post-exilic Jerusalem put back together. All right? So the two books that move history along after the captivity are Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, I've left some blanks that I need to fill in, and you'll notice that there's a bunch of blanks under Solomon to the exile. And basically what we say, at least I say, even though my son thinks I'm wrong, that during the Solomonic era, the books of Job, I'm not saying that Solomon wrote it, but it's a wisdom book, and we think that the time of Solomon was kind of the wisdom era in ancient Israel. So the argument is that Job was written in the time of Solomon. We don't know who wrote it. Doesn't say. Job didn't write it. It's about Job. The book of Proverbs was written. The book of Ecclesiastes was written. And the book of Song of Solomon was written. So we think that those four books emerged during the Solomonic era, or at least in that part of the monarchy. Okay? In the time of Ezra, the book of Esther was written, and the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written. 1st, 2nd Chronicles goes back and basically retraces the stories of Samuel and Kings. But he does it from a different perspective. We don't know who the chronicler is. Many people think that it's Ezra, but we don't know for sure. Okay? All right. Any questions on this? There's one big box I've still yet to fill out, okay? But before we go any further, any questions on what we've got on the board here?
Is there a test on this tomorrow?
Of course there is. Absolutely there's a test. Is it making sense? All right? I hope it is. I think it's important to see that this is your flow, and then you've got these books that kind of drop off as the story progresses. Okay? So that top line moves the history along. All right. We're going to do the prophets now. All right? Now, if you look at your notes, if you look on the next page over, you'll notice that everything is already written out for you. So I didn't tell you about that so you would take notes, but now that you've got that page in front of you, you can use that one. That was a little deceptive. Some of you already picked that up, all right? So basically what you've got on that back page is Genesis through and then what I've just talked about. So now that box at the bottom of the page are the prophets. And the prophets fall into three categories. They either are prophesying before the exile, during the exile, or after the exile. Okay? The critical thing to remember about the prophets is exile. They went into, Northern Kingdom went into captivity in 722. Southern Kingdom went into captivity in 586, 150 years later. But the prophets either fit into prior to all of that happening, during the exile, especially of Babylon, and after the exile. They all had to do with God invading their world because they had, in fact, apostatized, and he sent them into exile. All right? So, when you think of prophets, think of exile and the violation of the covenant. He sent them into exile because he had made a covenant with them way back in the Pentateuch, way back in the days of Moses. He had made a beautiful covenant with them, but they had violated, they had not maintained the 613 stipulations, they had not remained faithful to God and worshiping God alone. They were worshiping other gods, other idols, and God said, enough. And he had prophesied in Deuteronomy 28 that if you don't obey me, I'm going to send you into exile. He actually said that in Deuteronomy 28. Moses said that to that Pepsi generation way back when. And finally said, enough. Okay? So, the easiest way to remember these is the last three books of the Bible, Haggai, Zechariah, and by the way, it's in your notes now, so you don't need to scramble and write these down. Okay? Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are all prophets that function after the exile. All right? And basically what they were doing was stop doing the things that they were doing before the exile, otherwise God's going to invade again. Come on, you people. You've just got back from Babylon, and you're still doing the things that the guys prior to Babylon are doing. You're worshiping other idols. You're marrying women that are not part of the Jewish community. You're not keeping Sabbath. You're not keeping the law. Come on, people. All right? By the way, that's how you're to read the prophets. They were revivalists. They were grab you by the scruff of the neck and shake you. That's what they were. They were not nice people. Okay? If you had them for a Bible conference one year, you would not invite them back because they would blister you for a week, all right, about your apostasy and wickedness. Okay. All right. During the exile, we have Daniel. We have Ezekiel. The book of Lamentations was written in the exile because it's lament over the fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has fallen. Lamentations, we don't know who wrote the book. Maybe Jeremiah, we don't know for sure. And the other one that was written during the time of the exile was the book of Obadiah. Okay, Obadiah is one chapter long. And Obadiah the prophet writes it against a group of people called the Edomites. And what happened was when Nebuchadnezzar wiped out Jerusalem, the Jewish people from Jerusalem fled into the region of Edom, which was in the south. And the Edomites would capture them as they were fleeing and drag them back and hand them over to Nebuchadnezzar. And Obadiah comes along and says, God's going to get you for that. That's basically what the book of Obadiah is. Woe unto you, Edomites, for how you treated God's people when they were in a very difficult situation. All right? Okay? Then, basically, we can say the rest. Okay? So, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Daniel, Ezekiel, Obadiah, and Lamentations. And then the rest are Isaiah, Jeremiah, not Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, not Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, not Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, not Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Okay? So if you know those prophets, that's where they fit. And basically what they were doing was saying, watch out! The exile is coming. Repent. Maybe God will spare you. Maybe God will delay it. Maybe you will not be the generation that fits into his judgment. And they are all warning about impending judgment. That's the fundamental idea of the prophets. Okay, so this is what I call kind of an overview. We talk about 30,000 feet. This is the overview of the Old Testament. I hope that this will make some kind of sense to you. And yes, there will be an exam tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. God bless you all.